Hey, good morning, Austin Oaks Church. How's everyone doing this morning? It's kind of a cloudy. Is this the Saharan dust we're supposed to be getting flying in from Africa? Pretty crazy how that can travel halfway across the world and hit us. So I think today's the day we're supposed to get it coming in. So if I'm like suddenly surrounded by a sandstorm, and this devotional just comes to an end really quick, don't worry. I'm right here. The door to my house is right here. I'll dive for the doors. You do the same thing if you're in a dangerous spot. Be safe. You never know what can happen these days. Honestly, nothing surprises me anymore. So, hey, would love to hear that you're here. It looks like a number of you are on this morning. So, Joseph, great to have you here this morning. Good to see you. Tim, just saw you last night. Great to see you too at our worship night. Last night we had our Thursday night worship night at the church. It's a beautiful night, actually, pretty cool, really nice breeze. So look to the east at 8:45. All right. Sounds good. Actually, last night it was pretty beautiful. You could already start to see some of the dust and stuff coming in. Oh, Jenny's coming in from LA. Oh, you're from LA. Gotcha. Yeah, probably reminds you of home, huh? All this dust and all this stuff blowing around, the colors in the skies. Linda, good to see you this morning. Hey, I'm excited about what we have this morning, as well as a little not tentative, but just realizing we're gonna step into a topic that's very challenging, extremely controversial, but I want to approach it from a slightly different perspective to avoid the controversy and really dive into the truth. To tell you the truth, honestly, today we're gonna look at a little preview of tomorrow's sermon. So you're getting a little bit of a snapshot into what's coming. We jumped in and started this series on Ephesians. Tomorrow I'm preaching on a handful of verses from chapter 1, from verse 3 down to 14. But we're just going to look at a little slice today, the first 3-4 verses of this that are incredibly powerful. This whole section is an incredible passage, one of absolute total praise by Paul. It's a whole long run-on sentence. He doesn't even put a period in there, as Paul often does, is he's just caught up in praising God. And it's both praising as well as just rich truth and theology about who God is. But there's some challenging topics in here, some that people have struggled with for many, many years and still do. I just want to dive into this first little section of it, the first 4 verses, 3 through 6, and talk about this concept of God's sovereignty and his goodness. And I think the two have to be brought together, as we'll see why that's so important. So let's take a look. Let's jump in. Good to see you all this morning. Tomorrow, sorry, it's not tomorrow, on Sunday. It is only Friday. But yeah, if you want to hear more of this, I'm going to be preaching on this the whole within that whole context of the passage. But this one little section is a little teaser for you. We're going to get into it a little bit more today than what I can do on Sunday, but would love to hear your comments and even questions as we go through this. So let's take a look at our passage that we're going to look at in Ephesians 1, verses 3 through 6. So I'm going to add this to the stream so you can see it as well. So starting just below this says the little subtitle of God's rich blessings. Let's read from verse 3 to 6. It says, "Blessed is the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in the heavens in Christ." And he's going to tell us how. So that's a summary statement. What has God done? He's blessed us with every single spiritual blessing in the heavens in Christ. So Paul's praising him for that. He's blessing this God who's done all these great things. And now he's going to go on and describe them in the next handful of verses, really through this whole section. So he says, "For he chose us in him before the foundation of the world to be holy and blameless in love before him. He predestined us to be adopted as sons through Jesus Christ for himself, according to the good pleasure of his will, to the praise of his glorious grace, that he lavished on us in the beloved one. Okay, so a couple things that's really important to see in here. This first part is all about the big picture of what the Father has done in these spiritual blessings. So it's his ultimate plan in choosing us, in predestining us, in goodness, his sovereignty, in the sense that he is acting, he's the acting agent in this, and his goodness. And we must pair these things together so importantly. And this is, like I said, a hugely controversial topic. It has been throughout Christianity and the history of Christianity, and we're not going to solve it today, but I think we're going to bring some principles that we see here in the Bible that are so important for us to grasping this truth of God's sovereignty and balancing it with his goodness. And here's my first point I want you to see in here is our struggle to reconcile God's sovereignty with our ability to make choices does not require one extreme or the other. So this is where we often go. We get caught up in our limited logic as people, and we start to think, well, if God's sovereign, then am I just some kind of a robot, a deterministic robot, and I'm not making any choices, and he's just determining everything? That's an extreme case that just doesn't match what we see in Scripture. Now, if you simply pull out this passages on God's sovereignty in the Bible, and that's all you look at, you could probably come to that conclusion because of the strength and how powerfully they talk about the sovereignty, how absolutely they talk about the sovereignty of God. But that's not a good understanding of God, because those passages aren't the only thing that God reveals in his word. So it's really important to understand this, is because we struggle to reconcile God's sovereignty with our ability to make choices, it doesn't mean we have to go to one extreme or the other. It's possible. In fact, there's not a major doctrine in the Bible where this skill, I don't even want to say a skill, this attitude isn't necessary of holding a tension of two things that seem impossible to us in our finite minds. And that's okay. The beauty of that is it should remind us of how limited we are as humans and how infinite God is. That God can be both absolutely sovereign and that he can give us the ability to make choices that actually make a difference, that have an impact. And even this morning, you all chose to get on this devotional this morning. You weren't sovereignly determined and as a robot just forced to get up and be here. You make choices that actually impact your life and have an impact. And that's true. In fact, the whole Bible, much of the Bible actually assumes that. There are tons, hundreds and thousands of commands in the Bible that elicit a response or a choice by those hearing them. And why would God put those commands in there if we had no ability to make a choice? So this is the first thing I think it's so important for us to understand, is get over ourselves, stop thinking too highly of ourselves that we can somehow reconcile these two things. And if we can't, we have to go to one extreme, that it's all about our freedom of choices, which means God's not sovereign, or it's all about God's sovereignty, which means we got to be deterministic robots. It's not. And that's not how the Bible even portrays it. In fact, here's what I want to point you to. Instead of this struggle pushing you to one extreme or the other, the struggle is a gateway to worship. In fact, we see it in this passage. We're going to see it in another one of the great passages in the Bible on sovereignty and where it leads to. In this passage, this should make us go, oh my goodness, like God is completely sovereign. There's nothing that's outside of his control. And yet I'm able to make decisions that are real. They're impactful. They change my life. They impact other people's lives. And yet none of those thwart or fall outside of God's sovereignty. I can't understand how huge, how big this God must be. And it should lead us to worship, just as it led Paul. Look at how he ends this section, that all this, according to his pleasure, is to the praise of his glorious grace that he lavished on us in the beloved one. Instead of us getting all anxious and angry and upset and challenging and divisive and trying to create one extreme or the other, this should just leave us to the fact of absolute worship in a God that's so big that he can sovereignly control all things, while at the same time allowing his created beings to make choices that have an impact and make a difference. I want to show you another place where this takes place, just to show you that this isn't an exception. This is really the rule when it comes to God's sovereignty. Romans chapter 11, which, if you're familiar with the book of Romans, that section of scripture is all about the sovereignty of God. It's the sovereignty of God and salvation throughout history with the Jewish people and now the Gentiles. And I'm not going to go into all those details, but it's one of the most challenging passages people have when confronting the sovereignty of God. But look where Paul ends it. Where Paul ends this, let me take you to this passage real quick, and that way you can see it for yourself. Where Paul ends this whole section is not in a big debate about it. Instead, it lands him with praise. Paul ends this section with praise. He says, "Oh, the depths of the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God." Meaning he's blown away. He's going, I don't understand how God can be like this. How can he have this knowledge? How can he have this wisdom? How unsearchable, he says, are his judgments. Meaning we can't fathom them. We can't fully explain them, and untraceable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? And who has ever given to God that he should be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. So I want to encourage you that as you address this idea of God's sovereignty and our choices, is keep this tension. Don't minimize either one of them in order to accommodate the other one, because they're both true. And every time you read a passage that's specifically about one of them, you're going to want to slide to that extreme, possibly, but you have to hold the tension of each of them, if that makes sense. So here's what I want to say to you. The reality of God's sovereignty does not eliminate the reality of our ability to make choices. You don't have to squish down one in order to accommodate the other. Not for God, anyways. He doesn't see that. He doesn't believe that. He affirms both of these things in his word. Now I want to go back to our passage here real quick. Let me switch back here. Because we're going to see some important truths in here as we do that. Okay. So let this struggle be a gateway to worship instead of a gateway to controversy or division or having to take one side or the other. Affirm both of these to the point where people go, well, wait a minute, you just told me we have freedom to choose. Yeah, we do have some freedom to choose. Well, wait a minute, I thought you believed in God's sovereignty. I do believe in God's sovereignty. People should look at you somewhat confused when you tell them what you believe about these, because you're describing something in a being, a God who is infinitely bigger than we are. And so, yeah, we are confused, and it leads us to humble worship that he can do this even though we cannot. Okay, so the reality of God's sovereignty does not eliminate the reality of our ability to make choices. Look at this verse in Proverbs chapter 16. It says, a person's heart plans his way. There God's telling us that our heart makes plans. It makes choices. But the Lord determines his steps. There we see God's sovereignty guiding and overseeing all of that. So yes, we make choices, but God determines our steps. So we have the ability to choose or make plans. God is sovereign even over that whole process. We see in this one verse the compatibleness of these two things. But here's some things we got to understand in this whole thing, okay? Here are some boundaries that go on this in general. That we're going to see are good things because of the fact of who God is our ability to choose, however, will never thwart the reality of God's sovereignty. So that is a boundary. Our freedoms or our choices have limits on them that God's sovereignty does not. And that makes total sense. It should make total sense because we're created finite beings. God's an infinitely powerful being. So our freedom of choices are under the umbrella of God's greater sovereignty. In no way does that make them insignificant. In no way does that make us deterministic robots. That's just simply inconsistent with what the scriptures say. But what we must humbly understand is that our choices never thwart the reality of God's sovereignty. So I want to take us back to the real problem or the real issue here, and we see it in our passage. And here's the heart of it: is our struggle with God's sovereignty is ultimately a struggle with his goodness. Let that sink in for a minute. Our struggle with God's sovereignty is really a struggle with his goodness. When we wrestle with God's sovereignty, his control over all things, it's honestly the reason we struggle with it is because there's still an element of brokenness in us. And this is going to be true of all of us, no matter where we're at. There's still an element of brokenness in us that believes we're able to make better choices than God could make for us. That's the truth. Just let that sink in. We hate when other people have control over us, don't we? I mean, from the very beginning, we have the terrible twos and toddlers. It doesn't take long for that to be expressed in us, and we want to do things the way we want to do them. That's part of our fallen brokenness as human beings. And so it carries over into our relationship with God. If we struggled with our parents having, or any kind of authority having control over us, yeah, certainly we're going to do that even with God. Here's the difference, though. Even though our parents or people in authority may have some goodness in them and may have ultimate, in general, good for us, they're fallen, and sometimes and oftentimes maybe even their control or their authority over us isn't used for good all the time. So we struggle to trust in someone who's sovereign. We struggle to trust in those who have control or sovereignty over us, just as we do with our government. We're seeing that even today because our government isn't perfect. They are sovereign in one sense in our nation, but we struggle against that. And what happens is we project that onto God. And we don't like it here. We want freedom of choice. We want to be able to do whatever we want to do. And especially as Americans, that we've made an idol and a huge value over the freedom to choose. We don't stop to recognize how that has influenced how we relate to God in a wrong way. So ultimately, this is where I think you need to struggle. Instead of the logic of what does it look like for God to be sovereign? How do I recognize this? The real struggle is, do I trust God's goodness? Because if God is perfectly good, let me just say this. And I'm not saying this is the case, okay? This is a hypothetical only to make the greater point of why God's goodness and our struggle is so important there. I'm not saying God determines all our choices or even forces our choices, okay? I'm just making a hypothetical argument. But hypothetically, let's say God does force our choices. Let's say we go to that extreme and he sovereignly dictates all of our choices. If God is perfectly good and he dictated good choices into your life, how bad would that be? I mean, we might struggle against that for some other reason, but if we stop and think about it, we go, wow, how bad could it be if he was forcing us to make good choices? Now, I'm not saying that's what he does, because the Bible doesn't say that. I'm just trying to push the argument to the point that when we come back to the reality, we don't have as much of an issue with God's sovereignty. Here's a simple illustration. And it's imperfect because it's human, but I think you'll understand the point. So when we had little kids, or you've had little kids maybe, we would play outside, and sometimes they would go running towards the street. Okay, they'd be taken off towards the street, and there could be cars coming, and they were completely oblivious to that. And they were choosing to run into the street. And you know what I would do as a good dad, as a good, somewhat sovereign dad in their lives? I would determine the next choice for them, in a sense. I would run out there and I would grab them and I'd say, you are not choosing to go onto the street. You are choosing to come back into the yard, even against their will and their ability and their desire to choose otherwise. So here's my question for you. Would you call me a bad dad for sovereignly making that choice in my son's or daughter's life, that was making a choice that was going to result in a horrible end for them? Or would you call me a good dad? So again, I'm not saying that's how God operates with us. I make that extreme point simply to get to the heart of this issue, is our struggle with God's sovereignty is really not one of logic between God's sovereignty and our freedom to choose. Our struggle with God's sovereignty is pretty much 100% our struggle to believe that he's as perfectly good as he is. And we still believe, just like in the very beginning, that this issue was the very first issue in humankind, is we struggle to believe that God really knows what's best. We still think that we can make a choice that's possibly better than what God could make for us. And that's the issue in the Garden of Eden, right? Adam and Eve, seeing they're at the tree and they're thinking, well, maybe this fruit is good. Maybe God's holding out on us. That's exactly where Satan went with the first human beings that got us into this current predicament we're in for all of time. And the fact is, it hasn't changed. Our fallen, broken hearts still wrestle with this same truth. I want to help you put that to rest. I want to put it to rest in my life. I'm still working on this, but realizing where the struggle really exists is most of the battle. So here's something I want you to come to grips with. God is way more sovereign than you believe. In fact, I want you to say this. Just say this. Say, God is way more sovereign than I believe. Just say that. He's way more sovereign than I believe. That's a good thing to say. It acknowledges his greatness, his beauty, his power. He's way more sovereign than I believe. But I am way more responsible for my decisions than I want to accept. God's way more sovereign. I'm way more responsible. Those things seem incompatible, but both are truths that we need to live by to live rightly before God. Just like Adam and Eve, once they made that decision and they thought, oh, God's not good, he's not sovereign and good, so I'm going to step outside this boundary, I'm going to pick of this fruit. Guess what they did after that choice that they made? Rather than accepting responsibility, you know what Adam said? You can go to Genesis 3 right now and read this. Adam said, God, this woman that you gave me, she made me eat of this tree, right? So suddenly we want sovereignty. We don't want God to be sovereign. We want sovereignty. We make choices that are outside of God's best, his goodness. And then instead of accepting responsibility because we want the ability to choose, we then blame God for all this. And then he turns to Eve. And what does Eve do? Well, the serpent, he tempted me to eat it. Church, we haven't changed from the very beginning. This issue, this is why I'm just pausing to give a preview and dive into this a little bit. It is so central and core to who we are as Christians and how we view God. And it's why in this rich book of Ephesians, the whole first half of the first chapter is just this litany of praise from Paul on the sovereignty and the goodness and the beauty and the richness of God and how he has put together this plan of salvation for the good of human beings and for the praise and glory of himself. So important we understand this. So let me say this to you. Since God is perfect goodness, his sovereignty is an infinite blessing. So important we see this. Since God is perfect goodness, his sovereignty is an infinite blessing. So here's where we have to work against our experiences. We've all experienced levels of sovereignty or authority in our lives, whether it's in our homes, in our workplaces, with our government, with police officers. All these different things are mini cosmos of authority and sovereignty in our lives. The problem, though, with those is not that they're all bad. The problem is they're not perfectly good. And so there's always elements or layers of bad within them that leave us feeling hurt, feeling broken. And here's the challenge, is we often think if we could just put someone else in that position, if we could get a different political party, a different person in there, that would solve everything. But church, we've been doing this for thousands of years now. And it's always the same. The next person in power, sure, they might bring some other good things there, but there's always something broken in their leadership because they're not perfectly good like God is. And so we struggle to give them sovereignty in our lives. But that's not true of God. And it's why it's so hard for us to trust him as we should, because we have no human example in our lives. But it's true. And you may not fully understand it. You may not fully be able to logically explain it. You don't need to. It should lead you to humble worship in him. This is one of our favorite passages as Christians, right? It says, we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Just think about this, church. Here's a place where we can be a little bit logical, and it emphasizes this. It says all things work together for the good of those who love God. All things. It doesn't say that all things are good. It means that all bad things and all good things, everything works together for the good of those who love God, meaning his children who are called according to his purpose. Church, that is an impossible truth. That is an absolute blatant lie by God, unless he is sovereignly causing that to happen. Think about that, because there are things that have happened in your life. There are things that have happened in my life. There's things I'm still processing in my life that were not good. They're still not good. They're painful. They're hurtful. They're damaging. But God says every single one of those will work for good. And if he's not sovereign and have the power and the control to make that happen, then that's an absolute blatant lie. If God says, hey, well, I'm just leaving some of this up to the choices of human beings, and that's what's ultimately sovereign is our choices, if that's what we want, then guess what? You have to reject this truth. If you want total sovereignty, if you want total responsibility, if you want total freedom of choice, if that's your highest value, then you must reject the sovereignty and goodness of God and wonderful truths like this one in the scriptures. And I don't know any Christian. I've never met a Christian in my life. I'm not saying there's not someone out there, but I've never met a Christian in my life that does not love and cherish the beauty and the truth of this verse. But church, to accept this requires that we accept a God that we just got done talking about, that's absolutely sovereign and that's totally good. And that those two things lead us to absolute worship, not thwarting any choices that we make. We have the ability to make choices, but remembering our choices never thwart his sovereignty. And that's a great thing, realizing that even when you blow it, even when you make a horrible choice, we serve a God who absolutely is sovereign over even our worst choices, to bring them about for good in our lives. And that is not to excuse us of responsibility in those areas. No, sir. No, ma'am. In fact, it should drive us in humble submission and love to be even more wise and even more thoughtful and even more loving in serving God, in choosing what is right when we see how good he is. So I leave you with this simple truth. Choose wisely. Choose wisely because God gives you the ability to make choices, to respond to his truth, to respond to his commands. So do everything in your power to know what he wants you to do, to be responsible for the choices he's given you in your life. But then rest in God's good sovereignty. Rest in the fact that his goodness and his sovereignty can never be thwarted, can never be destroyed amidst our choices. And all we need to do is read the scriptures to see that over and over. So there you have it. We certainly haven't solved this issue by any means, but I hope, if nothing else, maybe you have a new perspective from which to approach some of these things. I'd love to hear your comments or maybe even some questions on this issue. I have to share this. In fact, I got to cover about 10 more verses tomorrow or Sunday on this passage. So there's no way I can talk about all the stuff we talked about today. So you guys are getting the behind the scenes and stuff I'm having to trim down to what's most important. But maybe share with me. This would be great. I'd love to hear this. Maybe share with me what was most helpful for you this morning, so that I know maybe some things that I can include and maybe some things that I could eliminate as I go into Sunday and have to cover the other aspects of this passage that talk about the Son's role in our blessings, our spiritual blessings, and the Spirit's role in our spiritual blessings. All we talked about today is God's, the Father's role in them, in his sovereign goodness in choosing a people and in doing it for our good, for our good pleasure, for his good pleasure, for us to be holy, for us to be adopted. So any questions? Any questions? Uh-oh, Tim's warning me. I'm going to get an email before his next one. So I'm sure this opens up a whole can of worms, and we're not going to solve all the issues in this controversy of sovereignty and our ability to choose or freedom of choice. But I want to encourage you. These things are what some would call compatible. They seem incompatible, but a compatibilist is someone who can affirm the sovereignty of God as well as the ability of humans to make choices in their lives, but keeping them under the proper perspective, meaning our choices can never thwart God's sovereignty, if that makes sense, his good sovereignty. So love you all. Hope y'all have a wonderful week. And again, any questions, I'm willing to hang out here for a little bit and field some questions. I would love to do that, but understand that everyone's got to get going to work here, and myself as well. I got a lot of work to do. Here's a good one. Is it wrong that you're calling these Devos and they have a song called Freedom of Choice? And I know that. I have to explain that one. I think I'm guessing there's some humor in that, Jenny. Tell me what that means, or explain that a little bit. Here we go. I love this. It's a beautiful mystery that gives us both confidence that God has everything in his hands, and yet gives us the joy of freely following after him. That's a great way, Rachel. Rachel Benavides from down in Laredo. Great to have you on, Rachel. I appreciate that. A wonderful perspective to bring to us as well, of seeing them both and seeing the beauty of both of them. Think of what happens if we didn't. Think of this. I heard someone say this that I thought was so profound. Think of how frozen you would be if you believed everything that happened in your life was dependent on did you hear that? If everything that happened in your life was dependent on your choices, think of how locked up and frozen you would be. Even getting out of bed that morning, you would be so over analytical on every choice you had, because that's what determines everything in your life. That would be a horrible state to be. And you'd be basically unmotivated if God was deterministic, meaning, oh, well, I'm just going to get up and go through some motions that some puppeteer is working me through. You'd have no meaning or no impact or no motivation to do anything. But God has us in the most beautiful spot, that he gives us a realm of choice that has impact, and yet he's sovereignly guiding the whole thing in a good way, church. That's what's so important. It's a good way. I love this, Camille. Thank you. I love the struggle as a gateway to worship. We have to mull on that and think of how that gets put into action in the mindset of extended struggles. That's a great thing. It should really lead us to humble admiration and adoration of God, just as we see it in Paul every single time he talks about it. He doesn't get into this controversy. He always ends up in worship. This one's good too. Great, Brenda, you getting it. Really like that one reality does not eliminate the other one. So great stuff. Now I get you, Jenny. Devo. Yes, I know Devo. The old group is what she was talking about. That's funny. That is too funny. You're going back. You're going way back. So I didn't even think you were that old to remember Devo. You just you gave yourself away there a little bit, Jenny. Sorry. That's been revealed in public now. Hey, love you all. Have a wonderful week. It's great to have you this morning. I'm excited to just enjoy this rain and continue working on my message. So you know how to email me if you have any thoughts or suggestions for Sunday. I'm going to have to cover 2 more whole sections in the same amount of time. So we'll see how well that goes. If I don't, I'm going to blame it on the sovereignty of God. How's that? Yeah. I don't think that's going to work. But anyways, love you all. Have a wonderful week. We'll see you next week or this Sunday.